What's up everybody, blessed be, my name is Manon and you are watching Witch in the Working, where we will be discussing all things witchy in and around, throughout and about, above, below, and beyond. This video offers my personal views on the topic at hand. Please visit me on my other platforms as well, including Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon, all linked down in the description below. The full script to this video and most of the others is available on my Patreon account for download if desired, to build your very own Witch in the Working Book of Shadows. Do you need help with a spell or fancy a tarot reading? Shoot on over to my store, Bewitching and Bizarre, with choices listed down in the description below for your personalized working and or reading. Okay, so this is one of those questions that makes people lean in a little closer and lower their voice before asking. Can you be a Christian witch? And maybe even more uncomfortable for some folks, can you be a Christian Wiccan? Depending on who you ask, you'll get anything from a thoughtful answer to a flat out absolutely not. Today, we're going to slow that whole conversation down, strip away the fear, the assumptions, and the knee-jerk reactions, and actually look at what's going on beneath the surface. This isn't about telling anyone what they should believe. It's about understanding history, practice, faith, and why this question keeps coming up again and again for people walking spiritual paths that don't fit into a neat little box. So without further ado, let's get into this one. Roll intro. Welcome back everyone. Let's start right where most people get stuck, on the words themselves, because when someone asks, can you be a Christian witch? What they're really asking is about identity, belief, fear, curiosity, and sometimes a lifetime of religious baggage. And if we don't slow down and unpack those words first, the conversation turns into people talking past each other instead of actually listening. So let's take a breath and get clear. When most people hear the word Christian, they imagine a very specific version of Christianity. Usually it's church on Sunday, a literal reading of the Bible, Jesus as the one and only path, and a clear line drawn between what's considered holy and what's considered forbidden. But Christianity isn't a single uniform thing. It never has been. There are Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, mystics, Gnostics, Quakers, folk Christians, and people who believe in Jesus deeply but don't feel at home in any church at all. For some, Christianity is doctrine. For others, it's devotion. For others still, it's culture, ancestry, or a personal relationship with Christ that doesn't fit neatly into a box. Now let's look at the word witch. For some people, that word immediately triggers images of spells, candles, herbs, tarot cards, or full moon rituals. For others, it brings up fear, misinformation, or old sermons about hellfire. But at its core, in most modern day definitions, witchcraft is not a religion. That's one of the most important points in this entire discussion. To keep things simple in modern day, we're going to consider witchcraft as a practice for this video. Even though I am kind of, as many of you know, I kind of bounce between witchcraft also being a religion. As for a Gardnerian witch, witchcraft is a religion. It's not just a practice, it's a religion as well. But I have plenty of videos on that. But for this video and for simplicity reasons, we're going to say witchcraft is a practice. It's a set of skills, techniques, and ways of working with the unseen world. Just like prayer, meditation, or ritual, it's a method of engaging with spiritual forces, symbols, and intention. That's where a lot of the confusion starts. People often assume that being a witch automatically means you believe in certain gods, reject Christianity, or follow Wicca, but none of that's inherently true. You can practice witchcraft and be pagan, Christian, Jewish, agnostic, or somewhere in between. Witchcraft is about how you work for spirituality, not who you worship. And then there's the word magic with a K, which tends to make things feel even more intimidating. But magic doesn't have to be dramatic or spooky. At its simplest, magic is focused intention combined with symbolic action. Prayer works this way. So does lighting a candle for healing, wearing a charm for protection, or repeating a psalm for comfort. When you strip away the labels, you start to notice something interesting. A lot of what people already do in religious settings looks an awful lot like magic. This is why the question, can you be a Christian witch, doesn't have a simple yes or no answer. It depends on what kind of Christian we're talking about and what kind of witchcraft is being practiced. If someone believes Christianity must be rigid, exclusive, and free of ritual creativity, then witchcraft will always feel incompatible. But if someone sees Christianity as a living, breathing spiritual path with room for mysticism, symbolism, and personal experience, the conversation opens up in a big way. It's also important to recognize why this question carries so much emotional weight. For many people, witchcraft feels like reclaiming power after years of fear or suppression. For others, Christianity feels like home, safety, and meaning. Asking whether the two can coexist is just a theological exercise. It's deeply personal. It's about whether someone has to abandon a part of themselves to fully embrace another. And here's the honest truth. People have been blending faith and folk practice for centuries, whether religious authorities approved it or not. The labels came later. The lived experience came first. So before we argue about whether someone can be a Christian witch, we have to agree on what we're even talking about. We have to understand that Christianity isn't one voice, witchcraft isn't one belief system, and spirituality doesn't operate on clean modern boundaries. Once we get that, the conversation stops being about permission and starts being about understanding. And that's where the real work begins. To really understand how Christianity and witchcraft intersect, we have to step out of the modern mindset for a moment. A lot of the tension we feel today comes from ideas that are actually pretty recent. If you rewind the clock far enough, you'll find that Christianity and magic weren't always standing on opposite sides of the fence. In fact, for a long stretch of history, they lived in the same house, sometimes arguing in the kitchen, sure, but still sharing the space. In medieval Europe, the average Christian didn't experience faith the way we imagine it now. Most people couldn't read the Bible. Theology wasn't debated in coffee shops or online forums. Faith was lived through ritual, story, symbol, and survival. When crops failed, people prayed. When illness struck, they prayed again. But they also used herbs, charms, spoken blessings, and holy objects. This wasn't seen as rebellion. It was just how life worked. Enter the cunning folk. These were village healers, charmers, blessers, and problem solvers. They were often devout Christians. They attended church, knew the saints, recited prayers, and believed deeply in God. At the same time, they healed livestock, removed curses, found stolen goods, and protected homes using techniques we'd absolutely recognize as witchcraft today. Psalms were written on paper and carried as talismans. Prayers were whispered over water or oil and used for healing. Saints were invoked not unlike spirits or guides. No one called this Christian witchcraft back then. It didn't need a name. It was simply faith in action. A great example of this overlap is the Book of Psalms. For centuries, Psalms were used magically, specific verses for protection, justice, love, or healing. People believed the words themselves carry power, not just meaning. That idea alone sounds suspiciously like spell work, and yet it came straight from Scripture. Then there are the saints. In folk Christianity, saints weren't distant historical figures. They were helpers, intercessors, specialists. Saint Anthony finds lost things. Saint Christopher protects travelers. Saint Jude handles desperate situations. People lit candles, made offerings, and promised acts of devotion in exchange for help. So if that doesn't sound familiar to the witches out there, then nothing does. The structure is ritual. The mindset is magical. The worldview assumes a responsive spiritual universe. So where does the witch come in? The word itself became a problem later, as the church gained more centralized power, especially during periods of social upheaval, famine, and disease. Practices that once felt normal started to look suspicious. Authority wanted control. Folk knowledge passed down outside official channels became a threat. Over time, the label of witch shifted from healer to heretic, from helper to danger. What's important to understand is that this shift wasn't purely spiritual. It was political, social, and economic. The same women who once cured a fever with prayer and plants could later be accused of consorting with demons, often for reasons that had nothing to do with religion. Land disputes, grudges, or simply being different could seal someone's fate. And yet, even during the height of witch persecutions, folk Christian practices didn't disappear. They went underground. They softened their language. They leaned harder on the Christian symbolism to survive. Crosses replaced older charms. Bible verses stood in for spoken spells. The structure remained even if the vocabulary changed. This is why it's misleading to say Christianity and magic have always been enemies. The divide we imagine today is largely a modern construction shaped by institutional fear and later theological rigidity. For most everyday people throughout history, there was no clean separation between prayer and practice. Both were tools for navigating a harsh and unpredictable world. Understanding this history doesn't mean romanticizing the past or ignoring real harm. It means recognizing that spiritual life has always been messy, layered, and human. When someone today talks about being a Christian witch, they aren't inventing something out of thin air. They're echoing a pattern that's been repeating itself quietly for centuries. Once you see that, the conversation shifts. Christianity stops looking like a monolith and witchcraft stops looking like an intrusion. Instead, you start to see a long, complicated relationship, one shaped by need, devotion, fear, and hope. And that history sets the stage for everything that comes next. This is the part of my video essay where things usually get tangled, so let's slow it down again and straighten a few threads out. A lot of people use the terms Christian witch and Christian Wiccan interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Understanding the difference isn't about gatekeeping, it's about clarity. Once you see where the paths overlap and where they don't, a lot of confusion simply falls away. Let's start with the easier of the two. A Christian witch is, at their core, a Christian who practices witchcraft or folk magic. Their spiritual center remains Christian. Jesus, God, the Trinity, saints, angels, or biblical cosmology still form the backbone of belief. Witchcraft, in this case, is the method, not the theology. It's how prayer is expressed, how ritual is structured, and how intention is focused. Psalms may be used instead of spells. Candles, oils, and symbols might be worked into prayer. Protection, healing, and blessing are common goals. Nothing about this automatically requires abandoning Christianity. Now let's talk about Wicca. Wicca is not just witchcraft with extra steps, it's a religion. A modern pagan religion specifically. It has its own theology, its own ritual structure, and its own way of understanding the divine. Most forms of Wicca center on the god and the goddess, often framed through polarity, cycles of nature, and seasonal festivals. Even eclectic Wicca still carries assumptions about divinity that don't neatly align with Christian doctrine. This is where the tension starts. Christianity, especially in its traditional forms, is rooted in exclusivity. One God, one ultimate divine authority. Wicca, by contrast, embraces a pluralistic and immanent view of divinity. The divine is present in nature, embodied in multiple forms, and expressed through balance rather than hierarchy. These worldviews don't just differ in style, they differ in structure. So when someone says they are a Christian Wiccan, the question becomes which system is doing the heavy lifting. Some people resolve this by reinterpreting Wiccan deities as symbolic rather than literal. Others see the god and goddess as aspects of the Christian God. Some place Jesus in the role of the God figure, and with the goddess understood as the Holy Spirit or divine feminine presence. For these practitioners, Wicca becomes a ritual language rather than a belief system. And for some, that works, but it's important to be honest about what's happening. At that point, Wicca is being reshaped to fit Christianity, not practiced in its traditional religious sense. That doesn't make it invalid, but it does make it different. The friction people feel around this topic usually comes from unclear definitions, not malicious intent. Here's another angle that helps. Witchcraft is adaptable. Religions are less so. Witchcraft has always been flexible. It shows up in many cultures wearing different clothes. It adjusts to local beliefs, available tools, and personal needs. Wicca, on the other hand, is a specific religious expression of witchcraft. When someone practices witchcraft within Christianity, the system bends easily. When someone tries to merge Christianity into Wicca, the bend becomes sharper. This is why many people find it easier to identify as Christian witches rather than Christian Wiccans. The former keeps belief and practice aligned. The latter requires ongoing theological negotiation. That negotiation isn't wrong, but it is demanding for sure. It asks people to hold contradictions with intention rather than pretending they aren't there. And that's really the heart of this part of the lesson. There's no spiritual police checking credentials. People will practice in ways that make sense to them, regardless of labels. But understanding the difference between a practice-based path and a religion-based path helps people move forward with honesty instead of confusion. It prevents unnecessary arguments and unrealistic expectations. When someone says you can't be a Christian Wiccan, what they often mean is these belief systems aren't built on the same foundation. When someone responds, well, I'm one, what they usually mean is this combination works for me. Both statements can exist at the same time without canceling each other out. Once you recognize that, the conversation shifts from arguing over permission to discussing intention, structure, and personal truth. And that's where meaningful spiritual growth actually happens. This is usually the moment in the conversation where people lean back, raise an eyebrow, and say, okay, now you've lost me, because talking about Jesus and witchcraft, and especially in a Wiccan style setting, feels strange to a lot of folks on both sides of the fence. Christians often hear circle and think sacrilege. Witches hear Jesus and assume dogma is about to crash the party. But once again, history and lived experience tell a much more interesting story than our knee-jerk reactions. Let's start with something simple. Jesus wasn't always approached the way modern Christianity presents him. Before creeds, councils, and official doctrine hardened his image, Jesus existed in the world as a healer, a teacher, a miracle worker, mystic, and social disruptor. He healed with touch, words, breath, mud, and intention. He calmed storms. He cursed fig trees. He spoke in parables filled with symbolism. Whether you see him as divine, inspired, or both, his story is steeped in acts that many witches instantly recognize as magical. That's why some witches feel drawn to Jesus, not as a rule giver or gatekeeper, but as a powerful spiritual figure. Very powerful witch, actually. In certain practices, Jesus is approached as a God form, a divine expression of compassion, sacrifice, and transformation. This doesn't mean he's being downgraded or mocked. Quite the opposite. For these practitioners, Jesus represents the archetype of the dying and rising God, the healer who walks willingly into suffering and returns transformed. That pattern shows up across many spiritual traditions, and some witches see Christ as fitting squarely into that mythic current. Others experience Jesus as a solar figure, light bringer, word made flesh. When you frame him this way, his presence inside ritual feels less like rebellion and more like continuity. Candles, invocations, sacred meals, and seasonal symbolism already echo themes found in Christian ritual. Some witches simply recognize that resonance and work with it consciously. Now let's talk about how this shows up in practice. In Wiccan-inspired rituals, some practitioners place Jesus alongside other deities rather than above them. For instance, he may occupy the role of the god in the god and goddess framework, while the goddess is understood through figures like Mary, Sophia, or broader divine feminine. Others work with Jesus independently, calling on him during healing rites, protection work, or acts of blessing without engaging the full Wiccan theology. For some, Jesus is approached much like a saint, powerful, responsive, and compassionate. For others, he's the central divine presence, while circle itself becomes a sacred container rather than a pagan statement. The tools may look Wiccan, but the heart of the ritual is devotional. This is where intention matters more than labels. Critics often argue that this kind of practice waters down both Christianity and Wicca. Sometimes that criticism has teeth. Blending traditions without understanding them can lead to shallow spirituality. But when done thoughtfully, this approach isn't about convenience, it's about relationship. It's about meeting the divine where it actually shows up in a person's life, not where a rulebook says it should. It's also worth saying this clearly. Not all witches who work with Jesus are trying to be Wiccan. Some are eclectic. Some are devotional magicians. Some simply borrow ritual structure because it works. Wicca becomes a language, not a belief system. And language, as we all know, can be spoken with many accents. For Christians, this idea can feel uncomfortable because it removes exclusivity. For pagans, it can feel intrusive because Christianity has historically dominated spiritual space. Both reactions are understandable, but neither reaction changes the fact that people are having real, meaningful spiritual experiences working with Christ in magical contexts. This part of the video isn't about convincing anyone to do the same. It's about acknowledging that Jesus doesn't belong to one spiritual expression alone. He never really did. Whether approached as a savior, mystic, God form, or healer, Jesus continues to walk into unexpected places, and for some witches, that includes the circle. And like it or not, that really isn't going away. By the time we reach this point in the conversation, most people realize something important. There's no spiritual referee standing on the sideline with a whistle, ready to call a foul. No one is handing out official certificates that say your practice is valid or invalid. What does exist, though, is responsibility. And that's what this part of the video is really about. Walking your path with honesty, awareness, and a willingness to look inward instead of outward for approval. One of the biggest mistakes people make when blending spiritual systems is rushing past discernment. It's tempting to grab pieces from different traditions because they feel comforting, powerful, or familiar. There's nothing wrong with that impulse, but problems start when people don't stop to ask why they're doing it. Are you incorporating a practice because it deepens your connection to the divine, or because you're trying to avoid difficult questions about belief? Are you building a spiritual life or just collecting symbols? Integrity begins with self-awareness. If you identify as a a Christian witch, Christian Wiccan, or something in between, it's worth sitting down and getting honest about what you actually believe, not what you inherited, not what you were taught to fear, and not what social media says is trendy. Do you believe Jesus is the sole divine authority? Do you see divinity as plural? Do you experience God as personal, cosmic, or both? These aren't questions you have to answer publicly, but they matter privately. Another part of integrity is respecting the traditions you draw from. That doesn't mean you need permission to practice your spirituality, but it does mean understanding context. Christianity and Wicca both carry deep histories, sacred symbols, and lived communities. Treating those elements thoughtfully prevents your practice from becoming hollow. It also helps avoid unnecessary conflict with others who walk those paths more traditionally. Criticism is inevitable. Christians may accuse you of straying too far. Pagans may accuse you of bringing baggage into a sacred space. If you wait for universal approval, you'll never move forward. Discernment isn't about silencing critics. It's about knowing which voices deserve your attention. Feedback rooted in care can help you grow. Noise rooted in fear or control can be set aside. This is also where boundaries come in. You don't owe everyone an explanation. You don't need to debate your spirituality at every family gathering or comment section. Sometimes walking with integrity means knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. Your practice is allowed to be personal. Mystery has always been part of spiritual life, and not everything needs to be defended or justified. One of the healthiest questions you can ask yourself is simple. Is my practice making me more grounded, compassionate, and aware? If the answer is yes, you're probably doing something right. You're on the right path. If your spirituality is creating constant anxiety, shame, or internal conflict, it may be time to pause and reassess, not because you're wrong, but because something may be out of alignment. It's also important to recognize that paths evolve. What feels true today may shift tomorrow. Growth doesn't mean failure. Many people start by blending traditions because they're searching, healing, or rebuilding after spiritual trauma. Over time, some settle into a clearer identity. Others remain comfortably liminal, living between the worlds. Both outcomes are truly valid. Integrity doesn't require certainty, it requires sincerity. At its best, spirituality should feel alive. It should ask something of you. It should invite reflection, not blind obedience. Whether you work with prayer, ritual, spellcraft, scripture, or silence, the heart of the matter is relationship. Relationship with the divine, relationship with yourself, relationship with the unseen patterns that shape your life. Walking the line between traditions isn't easy. It takes a courage to admit complexity in a world that prefers simple answers. But that courage is also where depth lives. When you stop asking, am I allowed, and start asking, am I being honest, you step into a much older and wiser conversation. And in the end, that's what integrity looks like. Not perfection, not purity, but a sincere commitment to walk your path with open eyes and an open heart. There's one thing this entire conversation points to. It's that spirituality has never been as neat and tidy as we like to pretend. Real faith lives in people, not rule books. Whether someone identifies as a Christian witch, works with Jesus in ritual, practices Wicca alongside inherited beliefs, or simply stands somewhere in between, the common thread is experience. Throughout history, people have reached for the sacred using the language and tools available to them. The moment we stop arguing over labels and start listening to lived practice, the fear fades and understanding takes its place. At the end of the day, the question isn't whether a path fits someone else's expectations. It's whether it feels honest, rooted, and alive to the person walking it. Spiritual growth isn't about passing a test. It's about paying attention. The sacred has always met people where they are, and it always will. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Witchin' and Working. Are you a witch who practices with Jesus? How do you feel about the concept of Christian Wicca? Let us all know in the comments below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, and please subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to ring that little bell to be reminded of the wonderful and exciting future episodes to come. I love you guys and gals. Blessed be.